Hey guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today we're talking about some of the top mistakes that we as anglers make when we are out on the water. If you can avoid these things, you will catch more fish this spring. Spring bass fishing is in full swing. At this time of year, my mind immediately goes to the shallows. I'm thinking about backs of creeks, coves, big flats. That's where a lot of these fish go as they're transitioning toward or into the spawn, and that's where I want to be. So I spend an incredible amount of my time up in the shallows, as I'm sure you do too. Now, the fishing there can be incredible. It can also be very frustrating if you're making mistakes. Shallow water puts you and the bass in close quarters. So if you are doing things wrong, it becomes very obvious, and it has a huge, huge impact on your actual catch rate. You will catch less fish if you're making mistakes. So today, we're talking about some of the key mistakes that we as anglers make so that you can be aware of them and you can try and avoid them. I've also got some key baits that will play into this. So as you're correcting the mistakes, there are baits that will help you be more successful as well. Mistake number one when we're talking about being up in the shallows is making too much noise. Now that sounds basic, right? We all know, don't make too much noise. If you fished with your dad when you were a kid, or your grandpa or a friend, you got shushed out on the water. You got told to be quiet. We know that, but it's the little things. It's the rod locker lids. It's walking heavy on the deck. Most importantly, it's two things that you're probably not thinking about. Number one, it is the speed of your trolling motor. The trolling motor in the water is loud if it's turned up high. I have seen countless times where I'm covering water and I've got my trolling motor turned up high and the fish are just darting away. They're just shooting off. And if I turn it down, they calm down. Sure, they might avoid me, they might get out of the way, but they don't take off like a rocket. So turn that trolling motor down. If you're not trying to cover a ton of water, set it on 3 or 4. Keep it nice and low and just pick your way through the shallows. That sound carries really far. The other thing with noise is your electronics. If you are in shallow enough water that you can physically see the bottom, turn your electronics off, or at the very least, turn them to standby. That will stop the transducers from pinging. If you've ever been in the water swimming around a boat and you swam under a transducer, the thump coming out of that transducer is hard. It hits hard. You can actually feel it thump you if you go underneath one. The fish are extremely aware of that in shallow water. And if you are fishing a place where a lot of people fish, where there's a lot of pressure, you better believe they know that transducer pinging means boats. So I love my electronics. I fish with them every day, but if I'm shallow enough that I can see and I don't actually need them, I shut them down. That will make a huge difference. Number two is going to be the size of your line. Okay, if I'm fishing a jig on 20-pound line in stained water in 20 or 30 feet of water, I'm probably good to go. If I'm throwing a swim bait on super heavy line, I'm probably good to go. If I'm flipping in heavy cover with 65-pound braid, I might be all right. But if I'm up here in clear, shallow water and I'm taking a little jig and I'm throwing it around a laydown, 65-pound braid, 50-pound braid, that's gonna cost me some bites. So number two is throw lighter tackle. And I've got a trick that goes with this. I've also got some baits that go with this. You specifically want to throw baits that you're comfortable throwing on lighter lines. So as an example, if you guys saw the video we just did talking about shaky heads versus finesse jigs, these are baits, both of them can be thrown effectively on 10 or 12 pound line. That's a lot lighter than the 15, 17, 20, 25 pound line that you might need for throwing a great big jig. So by dropping down in the size of hook and the size of bait, I'm able to go to lighter line, which will be less spooky to these fish. These fish, if the water's really clear, when you make a cast and your line lands on the water, we've noticed this in our underwater footage, your actual line laying on the water on a calm morning creates a great big line on the bottom. It creates a shadow and a disturbance on the bottom, and fish will move away from just the line being up on the surface. So the smaller the line, the more likely you are to not spook those fish out of the shallows. So again, a shaky head, a finesse jig, or my #1 all-time bait in April, a 5-inch Senko. Now, if I'm up around cover, I'm throwing it like this, 3/0 wide gap hook. But if I want to go really light, if the water's really clear, I'll switch over to a wacky hook, and I can drop down to 6 or 8 pound line, and I'll get even more bites. Now here is the trick. I mentioned there is a trick with this. A lot of people are gonna think, you know, where I fish, I can't do that. There's too much cover. And I understand the concern, because I used to be the same way. I used to fish heavy cover with extremely heavy line, and in some situations I still do. Specifically when it is around grass. If you've got heavy grass and you hook a big fish, they will go through the grass. It is just what they do. But if you're fishing docks, if you're fishing around brush, if you're fishing laydowns, when you set on a fish, if you hit them with a flipping stick and heavy line, they will fight you with everything they have. But check out this trick. If you drop down, I notice this a lot when I'm throwing BFS gear or I'm throwing a spinning rod. If you drop down in line size and you stick one, say I'm throwing that Senko on a wacky rig, and I stick one up around a tree, I hook them. But after that, I don't pull on them as hard as I can. I just keep pressure. They want to move, I just sort of follow them. I keep the rod bent, but I'm not pulling as hard as I can, because the harder you pull, the harder they fight back. If you just keep pressure on them, your hook will stay in place, and most of the time, now not all the time, but most of the time, those fish will choose to swim to deep water, which is typically away from the cover. So I can throw up here against a laid down tree, hook them on 6 pound line, and as long as I put a little pressure on them, they'll almost always swim right out to where it's safe for me to fight them. Now I could also throw really heavy line in there, stick them and force them to where I want them. But again, if the water's clear, drop down in line size, change the way you're fighting those fish, and you will be amazed that you can still catch them on that light tackle. #3 is that you don't have to see these fish to catch them. So many people in the springtime want to get right up on the bank so that they can see with their eyes. The closer you get to a fish in shallow water, the more likely they are to try and put distance between you and them. You can be incredibly effective from a distance. I can cast all the way to the back of that cove from here. It's a long cast, but I can do it. And I could make 3 or 4 casts back there. Now, might I overlook a fish? Might I miss one? Sure. But are the odds of me catching a few out of there a lot higher from here than they are if I take my boat up there and look first? You better believe it. So try to be cognizant about staying back from the fish if you have an option. Now you might be in a little creek channel somewhere where you don't have a choice. All you can do is throw ahead before you get there. But if you can control it, intentionally stay back and use lures that will help you find the fish. Yes, I can pick it apart slowly with a Senko, a shaky head, a finesse jig. I can also cover water with a square bill, a top water, or an underspin, and I'll get more into that here in a second. But again, staying back from those shallows. Now, mistake number 4 actually plays into that exact same scenario, and that is essentially the same thing, but for a different reason. Don't go into the shallows to retrieve your snagged lures. Now, I'm not suggesting that if you throw a $30 bait into the back of that pocket and it gets stuck, you should just break it off and forget about it. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that that particular lure probably shouldn't have been back there in the first place. So try to be cognizant of that ahead of time by fishing lures that won't get snagged. The reason why is that when these bass are first pushing back in the shallows, they're coming out of deep water. They wintered in deep water, which means they're not used to the boat pressure. In summer, in fall, they've been around boats all year. But right now they're coming out of winter. Those fish aren't used to the boats. So if you press in there with them, they are much more likely to panic and bail out than they are later in the year. So again, it's all about these baits that are less likely to get snagged in the first place. I love to throw a small swim bait in the spring. I love to throw it with a blade on it. That's an Owner Flashy Swimmer. And I'm gonna link all these baits in the video description for you. I'll give you the exact sizes, the exact weights, the hooks, our favorite colors for each one of them to really help you out the best that I can. But lures that won't get snagged in the first place are a huge advantage. So a weedless rigged swim bait, huge advantage. If I want to cover water aggressively, a square bill is one of my best options. A square bill can be fished shallow. Now it's got treble hooks and they're dangling, so it can get snagged. But the design of that lip, that squared off lip, is excellent at deflecting and bouncing its way over and through cover. It'll bounce off stumps, it'll bounce over logs. It's really effective at staying out of that stuff versus, say, a lipless crankbait, which would immediately snag up if it came over the top of a stump. So a bait like a square bill will cover a lot of water. I can choose one that hits the exact depth range I like, but this biggie, in fact, that's my favorite, the biggie and cold-blooded, that exact one, will cover a ton of water. It fishes really effectively from 3 to 5 foot, where a lot of these bigger fish are holding in those shallows. And I just don't snag up. I never have to go in there to get it. And then the last one, an obvious one that won't snag up, is a top water. This specifically is a popper. This is a Pop Max. It's a larger popper as poppers go. It's a little bit bigger than the average bait, but a popper is a great option for firing back into a calm pocket like this, and just pop and just let it sit there. Pop, let it sit there. Even if you don't think there's a topwater bite on your lake, there probably is, especially in that shallow, calm water, because it's one thing for a fish to be out on a point somewhere, 10 feet of water over their head, and you to be out there throwing a top water going, they're not here. But when the fish are up there in this much water and the popper lands on top of them, it's only that far away. It's not a big deal for them to just slurp it down, especially a slow moving popper. Now, we'll go, a lot of these videos, you know, the jig versus the shaky head. We just did an in-depth video about that. We've done a lot of in-depth videos about square bills, about underspins and swim baits. We'll do another one on top water soon, really go in depth on that subject, but just know early season, it can be an incredible option, and obviously it will keep you out of the snags. Now, last but not least, the final mistake that I think is a huge deal that a ton of anglers do wrong in the spring is that they fish dead water. What I mean by that is if you're out on the lake and you're fishing with your buddy and nobody's getting bit, and one of you turns to the others and says, I swear this is the Dead Sea. Have you ever been in that situation? I have. There's no fish here. They must have all jumped over the dam. You're probably right. I hate to break it to you. You're probably right. Now, you're not right that they jumped over the dam, but you're right that there's no fish right there. The reason why I say that is in the spring, fish school together. You hear us constantly talking about targeting schooling bass. The upside of that is huge. You get 1 to bite, you might get 20 to bite, you might get 50 to bite, you might get a 10-pounder to bite. The downside of that is that if there's a giant school of fish right here, that means that all of this has no fish. All these fish all congregated right here. So this time of year specifically, I'm not saying all year long, I'm saying in the spring, right now, if you are fishing and fishing and fishing and nothing is happening, don't just continue to beat dead water. Get on the move. Now, if you're a pond guy, different situation, right? You have an area you can fish. Fish it. Do the best you can. But for the guy on the bank on a larger lake, go to a new area. For a guy on a boat, fire up. Let's move this pattern. It may be that your baits are fine and your location is wrong. We see that play out all the time where, say you're in a tournament, you do something all day long and it should work and it just doesn't. And then you get to weigh in and you find out that other guys did the same thing and they caught them. Well, your technique wasn't wrong, your location was. This time of year, fish congregate, which leaves vast areas without fish or with very few fish in them. So focus your time where spawning bass will be headed. Backs of creeks, up on flats, the last secondary points headed back up an arm, back in pockets, shallow coves, those likely locations. And don't just continue to thrash the water aimlessly when it's not working. Get on the move, try another spot. Get on the move, try another spot. When you find a spot where you get bit, stick it out. Fish that area, see if you can replicate it. Try a couple different baits. See if you can get more fish to bite before you keep moving. That is oftentimes what sets the incredibly effective anglers away from everyone else in the spring, is just their willingness to keep going. When I guided aggressively on Clear Lake, day after day after day after day after day, the key was movement. Just because I caught them here yesterday didn't mean I would fish there today. I would move and move and move and move until I found an area with fish, and more specifically an area with fish that wanted to bite then. And then we would just wail on them until they were done. As soon as they were done, we're back on the move. We're searching for fish again. Don't get married to a single spot and you will do much, much better. Now, yes, there are key baits that make a huge difference. And again, I'll link them all down in the description because these are our confidence baits. These are baits that we know we can rely on. And if we pull up in a spot and it doesn't work, it's not the baits, it's the spot. And we'll just keep going. But again, the right baits in the right places is the key. Hopefully this helps you guys. The video title, mistakes that bass anglers make. This isn't a downer on bass anglers. This is simple things that we can change that make a huge difference, and it will make a huge difference for you. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll talk to you soon.